All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan. To thank Meir and Rachel Gold for dedicating all of the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of Yonah, Tzvi, ben Yosef, Chaim, Elazar, HaKohen, Zichron Livracha. We thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Noam and Leah Efron, in honor of and celebration of the 98th birthday of Noam's grandfather, Yosef Hershel ben Mordechai Halevi, and in great appreciation to the Daf Yomi Shir. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Avron Sean and Judah Elbaum, for dedicating the Shiurim and Drushos this week in the Schus of Refuah Shalima for Ami Ben Chaya. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, he together with Kol Choli Yisrael will have a complete and enduring Refuah. All of the Neshamas will have an Aliyah, the families in Nechama. And we'll say, with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Lamed Ches 38. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem. We have a lot to do today. Lamed Zayin with base 37b. We left off at the first wide line, Itmar. So we'll say, remember again, we are dealing with the fascinating sugya of shared items. Remember again, the topic of the Mishnah was that your Gashmios takes on the tchum of your person, right? So whatever tchum you have, your kelim, your utensils have the same exact tchum. So we left off, we did a little bit of in a rushed way yesterday with the case of the two people who borrow a talis together, right? And the idea being that one needs it for the Suda Shabbos night, one needs it for Shabbos day, they're going in different directions. So along that same theme, the Gemara says as follows, Itmar, Shnaim shalakhu chavisu behema b'shutfos. Well, so here's the case. Reuven and Shimon purchase an animal or a barrel of whatever, doesn't make a difference, on Erev Yom Tiv. They purchased it in partnership on Erev Yom Tiv, and their intention is to split I forgot one more sponsor, Baruch Meir and Rina Dubin, dedicating the shir today in honor of all of those who passed and did so wonderfully on their Smichas Chaver Bechinas. Shkayach, and I thank you for the sponsorship. Many of whom, Baruch Hashem, are here now. So the Gemara says as follows. So two people go ahead and purchased an animal or a barrel of whatever on Erev Yom Tiv. They didn't split it on Erev Yom Tiv, but they split it on Yom Tiv itself. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Rav Amar Chavus Muteris. So Rav says the barrel is muter. Now what that means is that when they divide up the contents of the barrel, Reuven could take his contents, in his tchum. Shimon could take his contents in his tchum. However, ubehema asura. But I will say, interestingly enough, the behema is asur. Now, what does that mean, behema asura? Behema asura means that when they slaughter and split up the animal, the meat is limited to the area of the overlapping tchumen. Right? That's all. So the Rav says when they split up the barrel, the contents, each could take it to their own tchum. But when they slaughter the behema, the meat is limited to the overlapping tchum. Okay, Shmuel Omer Chavis Nami Asura. Shmuel says no, both behema and chavis are asura. But say again, remember, asura in this context means that unlike other items which take on the tchum of the owner, these items could only be moved in the overlapping tchum areas. So we'll say, let's analyze. Really, this is going to be a great sugya. My kasavar Rav. So we'll say we're focused right now a bit more on Rav. What does Rav hold? Ikasavar yesh breira. So we'll say, so remember again, the Gemara presupposes that this automatically is a breira question. Because remember again, you have two people who bought something in partnership Erev Yom Tiv. They don't divide it up until Yom Tiv itself. So bepashtos, this is a breira issue. If you hold breira, yesh breira, then what? Then it turns out that the division, is retroactively chal as of when? Erev Yom Tiv. If that's the case, then everybody's stuff should take on their tchum. If you hold ein breira, there is no retroactive clarification. That means the division effectively happened on Yom Tiv. Well, if the division happened on Yom Tiv, the problem is tchum is established when? Bein hashmashas, at the onset of Yom Tiv. So the overlapping tchumen makes sense. So the Gemara says, I don't understand Rav's position. If Rav holds that there is breira, so even when they slaughter and split up the animal, each partner's meat should take on his tchum. And if Rav holds that there's no breira, no retroactive clarification, afilu chavis nami asura. even the contents of the barrel should be asr. And once again, asr meaning what? Meaning what? Limited to the area of overlapping tchumen. To which the Gemara says is interesting. V'olam kasavar yesh breira. Rav holds yesh breira. Right, that's what Rav holds. Rav subscribes to the concept of retroactive clarification. If that's the case, then when Reuven and Shimon slaughter their jointly owned animal on Yom Tov, Rabbi say, what should happen? What should happen? Each partner's meat should take on their own tchum. Shanya behema tekayanki tchumen mehadadi. So we'll say this is very interesting. A behema is different because since a behema is one intact living organism and each part derives, we'll call it nourishment from the other, the two tchumen themselves are interwoven. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. This is very interesting. Rashi says, the olam kasava yesh breira. Rashi says, Hilchach chavis muteres b'shani behema shahaisa b'chaya ben hashmashas. So the problem with the behema is it was alive ben hashmashas. V'chol evireh b'chayeha yonkim zeh mizeh. When the animal is alive, all the parts of the animal derive nourishment from each other. Therefore, umishechashecha yanak kol aver ve'aver mishel chavero ve'in kan livrar. Rabbi say this is fascinating. Essentially, what the Gemara is suggesting is that Rav holds a breira. But he holds that by an animal you can't really say breira. Why? Because all of the parts are inherently intertwined. Since it's one living organism, all of the parts are intertwined, and therefore you can't say breira. See, what's interesting is as follows. Imagine you have a barrel of wine. So remember again, Reuven and Shimon buy the barrel of wine together. They split it on Yom Tov. Yesh breira will say, when Reuven gets his part, what's the tchum of his part? His tchum. Right? Because retroactively it's clarified that this was really my portion as of Erev Yom Tov. Why does that work, says Rav? Because the two parts of the wine do not require each other for existence. There is no interdependency between them. Rav, however, will say by an animal, because there is an interdependency by the parts, therefore by definition it's hard to say that breira works to clarify that this was my portion from the beginning. Because this is my portion from the beginning means this is my portion totally fundamentally and wholly independent of the other. But you can't say that by a living organism. Therefore, Rav will say that when you split up the behema is limited to the area of overlapping tchumen. But ultimately the barrel, the wine, the content, or whatever the contents of the barrel, assume the individual tchumen of each other. Amr le Rav Kahana Rav Asi le Rav le'isr muktalo chashashu le'isr tchumen chashashu. So interestingly enough, Rav Kahana Rav Asi said to Rav, I don't understand. So for muktzah, you're not worried about. In other words, they both say there's another piece. The other piece ultimately is that because they know about this partnership, right? They bought the animal b'shutfus. Ultimately, Erev Yom Tov, that means each person, each partner withdraws, so to speak, from the chelek of the other. Look at Rashi, second wide line, Le'isr muktzah lo chashashu, anan sahadi de kol chad minayhu, akzi daite michelko shel chavero, vim hayurotzim la'achla kan eina asura le mishum muktzah, lomar kol chelek yonak mechavero, v'yesh kan muktzah, ula'alicha ish letchumo, ata osra le mipnei, so I'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara just says, each partner literally withdrew from the portion of the other. They knew on Erev Yom Tov what each one was going to have. So you're not worried about muktzah, but you're worried about tchumen, shasek Rav. So Rav was quiet. So my haviyala. So we'll say, bottom line, what's the halacha? So we'll say, so here's what happened. Is we talk about this case of partners who buy something jointly on Erev Yom Tov, but they're not dividing it. So we'll say the easy way to sidestep this whole discussion is how? Divide up everything when? Erev Yom Tov. Okay, so but they're not doing that. So they're dividing it up Yom Tov. So the shaila is an interesting case because already on Erev Yom Tov, I know that 50% of this is mine and 50% of this is Reuven's. I know that. Just the actual physical chalukah is not taking place until Shabbos. So the shaila now is, or Yom Tov, I should say, when we divide it up on Yom Tov, what's the tchum of our respective portions? So essentially, leaving aside the distinction between animals and barrels, let's shelf that for now. But now, essentially, what we're deciding is this is fundamentally rooted in yesh breira or ein breira, which I both say is a shas machlokes. Do we subscribe to the concept of retroactive clarification, yesh breira, or do we reject it? So the Gemara says, "My havi Allah." By the way, what is the halacha with yesh breira or ein breira? Because obviously that will impact this particular discussion. Again, like I said, leaving aside the distinction between the parts of the animal interdependent of each other, we'll leave that on the side for now. My havi Allah. We'll say, here we go. Very exciting. Rabbi Oshia Amar yesh breira. Rabbi Oshia says we do subscribe to the concept of retroactive clarification breira. Rabbi Yochanan Amar ein breira. Rabbi Yochanan says no breira. Rabbi Oshia yesh breira. Is that true? That Rabbi Oshia holds of the concept of breira? Is that actually true? V'hatanan, we learned hames bebayis v'lo psachim harbe. So we've seen this case many times. So isn't this the exciting part of the daf? That when you see a case, like, okay, I might not understand all the intricacies of it, but Lamaisa, it's so wonderful. You know what it's like? It's like, sometimes you see someone who you've known for a long time, but it's one of those situations where you're not sure of their name, right? So it's like, I have such a warm feeling towards you because we know each other. I'm not sure of your name, but I know that we know each other. Sometimes you see cases in Shas, I'm like, we know each other. Okay, I don't know exactly but again, there's such a beautiful warm feeling in the familiarity of it. So the Gemara says as follows, but now we're going to learn the name. Hames bebayis v'lo psachim harbe. We'll say if you have a corpse in a home and there are many entrances in the home, kulam to me. Remember again, we've seen this case many times. Namely, that halacha l'mais, when you have a corpse in a home, technically speaking, anything under the doorways, right, could contract ritual tumah. So therefore, again, especially in this case where you don't know which doorway you're going to use to extract the mace, halacha l'mais, everything under the doorways becomes tameim. Niftach echad mehem. But once one of the doorways is open and it becomes clear that that is the doorway through which the mace is going to be transported, hu tameh v'kulan tahurin. That particular doorway, when we say the doorway, we mean the contents under that doorway will be tameh, and every other doorway and its contents is tahar. Chashav lo tzia be'echad mehen, o bechalon sheish ba'arba al arba. Once you have kavana, chashav means you didn't even do anything. You just had intention to go ahead and take it out of one of the entranceways, or even out of a window that has 4x4 tefachim. Matzeles ala psachim. Ultimately, that saves all of the other entranceways / exits from tumah. Beishamai says, "V'hu shechashav alav od ad shelo yamos hames." Beishamai says, yes, that's true. But that's only if you had in mind which entrance you're going to use or exit you're going to use when? Before the person died. Beis Hillel says, no, even if you only have in mind which exit you're going to use once the person died, that also saves all of the other exits from Tumah. And Abba said, the Gemara says, now, bepashtos, what's the machlokis Beis Shammai Beis Hillel? Yesh breira, ein breira. Beis Shammai says ein breira. Therefore, once you decide, that'll have impact going forward. Beis Hillel will say yesh breira, and therefore, ultimately, again, that has an impact even retroactively. B'itmar Allah, Rabbi Oshia said, "L'taras hapsochim mikanu lahaba." Rabbi Oshia is on record as saying that kavana to take the mace out of a particular entrance or exit, I keep saying entrance, exit, only works to go ahead and purify the other exits from this point forward. However, mikanu lahaba in lemafreya lo doesn't work retroactively. So we'll say here you have Rabbi Oshia on record essentially saying what? Ein breira. Ein breira. That contradicts what we just said before, because before we said, Rabbi Oshia says, yesh breira, to which the Gemara says, you're right, epoch, Rabbi Oshia Amar ein breira, Rabbi Yochanan Amar yesh breira. You're right, you got to switch things around a little bit. Rabbi Oshia is the one who said ein breira, Rabbi Yochanan said yesh breira. Good, beautiful, that worked, except now we have another problem. Umi isle Rabbi Yochanan breira, does Rabbi Yochanan subscribe to the concept of breira? Does he actually agree to the concept of breira? Say, watch this case. This is fascinating. From Rabbi Yasi, Rabbi Yochanan, ha'achin shechalku lekuchosein umachzirin ze lo ze biyovel. Rabbi say this is fascinating. Rabbi Yochanan says as follows. That halacha l'maaseh, when brothers divide up an estate, right? Yaakov dies. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda divide up the estate. Rabbi say there are two different ways of looking at their relationship to the estate. Watch this. If you hold yesh breira, then it turns out that what? That the portion that each brother gets is what? the portion the father wanted them to have. If you hold ein breira, effectively they have a relationship of purchasers from one another. Because we'll say if you hold ein breira, that means when the father dies, every brother owns what? Every brother owns what? A particle of everything. A particle of everything. And essentially what they have to do is they have to buy each other out from their respective portions. Now you're thinking to yourself, okay, who cares? Like, bottom line is the same. At the end of the day, everybody gets their particular portion. They might even get the same amounts. Where does it come up, Rabbi? Yovel. Because what happens, again, by real estate transactions by Yovel, they revert back to their original owners. If you hold yesh brira, so it turns out when they divide up the estate, every brother gets what he was initially destined to get, and there's no overlapping ownership interests, nothing goes back by Yovel. If you hold, however, that they are purchasers, essentially in the estate, in other words, they're purchasing, they're buying out each other, well, if it's a purchase and it's real estate, then those portions, technically speaking, go back into the pot on Yovel. Incredible. So the Gemara says as follows. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says, brothers who divide up an estate essentially purchase from each other, and it has and they essentially have to return their respective portions by Yovel. So we'll say, what does that show? Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold of Breira. You just said before, Rabbi Yochanan holds a Breira. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold a Breira. Oh, maybe you'll say, okay, Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold a Breira by Da'araisas. So Yerusha could go ahead and be a Da'araisa, or I should say Yovel is a Da'araisa. Ultimately, so that's Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold of Da'araisas, but by Dirabanans, ultimately again, he will go ahead and hold of Breira. So we'll say, just to be clear, the Da'araisa in this case is Yovel, which is why Rabbi Yochanan would say that the brothers' portions go back into the collective pot or return to each other on Yovel. But by Dirabanans, what's the Dirabanan in this case? We are presupposing that Tchumin are Dirabanan. So in the Tchum case, Reuven and Shimon bought a barrel of wine together on Erev Yom Tiv. Don't end up dividing it until Yom Tiv. Yesh Breira, each partner's portion has his respective Tchum. So maybe we could say it like that. You could hold a Breira, but you only hold a Breira in Dirabanans and not Oraisa. Very fascinating. So the Gemara says, Umi Islay, is that true? Is that actually true? Vatani Ayo, Rabbi Huda Omer, Ein Adam Masna Shnei Dvarim Ke'echad. Rabbi Huda holds that you can't simultaneously stipulate on two things at once. We'll say now what this is talking about over here is Erev Tchumin, right? You want to make well. Let's here we go. Im Bachacham leMizrach Eruv leMizrach. Ulamayrav Eruv leMayrav. The Ilu lekana lekana. We'll say we've had this case. Another one of these Shas cases which you've seen. I want to make an Erev Tchumin. There's a skull in residence coming. Right, and I want to go hear him. So, but I don't know which direction he's coming from. So I can make two Eruvin. One to the east, one to the west. And I could say, whichever direction he comes from, that's the one I want to activate. What can't I do? I can't, let's say there are two scholars in residence coming, one from the east, one from the west. But I don't know who I want to hear yet. I can't make two Eruvin. I can't make that I can't do. So the Gemara says, Vavinamba, top of Lamed Ches. When we asked, Maishna lekana lekandalo, why can't you go ahead and make two Eruvin de'in breira? Because Rabbi say ultimately, again, we don't subscribe to the concept of breira. One second. Mizrach umayrav nami breira. So we'll say, but 1 second. Don't both of these cases rely on breira? We'll say either case, even where it's one Talmud Chacham, but I'm just not sure which direction he's coming from, east or west. So what do I do Erev Shabbos? I make an Erev to the east, I make an Erev to the west. And what do I say? When I wake up in the morning and I find out where he is, that should be the Erev. Isn't that breira? Isn't that breira also? To which the Gemara says, no, Rabbi Yochanan, ukvar ba Chacham. Rabbi Yochanan says, no. The case is where the Talmud Chacham already came to town. In other words, already before Ben Hashmoshes Erev Shabbos, he was already in town. So what's happening over here? What's missing? What's my knowledge? In other words, I don't know. The Metzias is already in effect. So therefore, again, I can make an Erev to the east and Erev to the west already by Ben Hashmoshes on Erev Shabbos. The Erev has already taken hold. It's just, I don't know. The Erev works, I don't know. So we'll say that does not rely on the concept of Breira. as opposed to going in and saying, Rabbi A is coming from the east, Rabbi B is coming from the west. I don't know who I want to see, so let both Eruvim go ahead and be there. I'll decide tomorrow morning which one I want to go to. That doesn't work because that's reliant on Breira. So what do you see over here? You see over here that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold of Breira, even by a D'Rabbanan. Because we're, again, presupposing that Tchumen are D'Rabbanan. What a mess. Alma, leslie Rabbi Yochanan Breira. So rather, Rabbi, you see that Rabbi Yochanan does not hold the Breira. So watch this. Remember, how did we get into this whole difficulty of Rabbi Yochanan holding Breira? Because what did we do? Remember, we flipped Rabbi Oshia, right? Remember again, when we started the sugya, we said Rabbi Oshia holds of Breira, Rabbi Yochanan does not. Then we had the contradiction from the Beitzah about taking out the mace with Rabbi Oshia, so we flipped Rabbi Oshia. No, Rabbi Oshia really holds Ein Breira, and Rabbi Yochanan holds Yesh Breira. Now we've seen Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold the Breira. So ultimately, again, we're going to go back. Let's restore to what we had. Let's take back. Rabbi Oshia is the one who holds Yesh Breira, and Rabbi Yochanan holds there is no Breira. So what do you do with the case about the mace? Watch this. Don't switch around anything. Rabbi Oshia Breira midaraisa. Aval b'dirabanan islay. So I will say, interestingly enough, the Gemara goes back, undoes the flip, and says in reality it's not a contradiction. Rabbi Oshia holds a Breira, but he only holds a Breira when? By dirabanans, not by deoraisas. And therefore halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Oshia will hold in the case of tumas meis. That's a doraisa. Therefore, he does not subscribe to the concept of Breira. But ultimately, when it comes to Tchumen, right, when it comes to going ahead and dividing up shared produce, shared product on Yom Tiv, we could hold of Breira, and that therefore retroactively each partner received his share that was really his on Erev Yom Tiv, and therefore each partner's produce will have that respective partner's Tchum. But let's say an incredible idea. It's interesting. I don't remember coming across this. We talk about Breira all the time, but this distinction between Breira in a Da'orai, no Breira in a Da'oraisa, Yesh Breira in a D'Rabbanan, quite fascinating. Good. Darash Marzutra, Halacha Kravoshia. Marzutra said, the Halacha Paz Raboshia, that we subscribe to Breira in D'Rabbanans, but don't subscribe to Breira in D'Oraisas. Amar Shmuel. Good. So we'll say Amar Shmuel. Shor Shal Patam, Hareyu Karagli Kadam. So let's see now back to some of these other cases. This is fascinating. Shor Shal Patam, we'll say Patam is a person who fattens up animals. So what's the pshat with this? Rashi says, Shor Shal Patam, it's the last short line in Rashi. Shemafatim Shvar Munkar. We'll say the Patam is a guy who fattens up oxen to sell them. So what's the halacha? Hori karagle kol adam. Ultimately, again, that's shor. So we'll say if you were to purchase that animal on Yom Tiv. So remember again, normally we were saying that we'll say what happens if before we saw this, if you purchased an animal on Yom Tiv, what we assume? What's the tchum of the animal? The owners, right? That's because that's the model that the Mishnah created for us. The Gemara is giving us some interesting exceptions to that rule. So if you purchase an animal from the fattener on Yom Tiv, so ultimately again that animal takes on the tchum of the purchaser. Take a look at Rashi. Hareyu karagli koladim, first wide line. Afilu ben irachere shebalakan al yedei eruv. Even if someone from out of the city came to purchase an ox from the fattener, they both said this is incredible. See, essentially, what does the fattener do with his oxen? Probably a better name than fattener, but right, what does the fattener do with his oxen? What does he do? He sells them. So therefore, the Gemara says something absolutely amazing. He knows he's going to sell his ox, especially on Yom Tiv, right? On Yom Tiv, people want meat, right? There's a mitzvah. So ultimately, again, because the fattener knows that he's going to sell, he has in mind that the tchum of this animal should be the purchaser's tchum. Now, I will say, what's the dramatic chiddush in that? Even though what? He has no idea who this person is going to be. But it's the nature of the mitzias. The nature of the Metzias is the fattener says, I'm the owner now, but I know I'm not going to be the owner on Yom Tiv. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, it takes on the tchum of the purchaser. Quite incredible. Shor shel roa. We'll say, what about the ox of a shepherd? Ultimately, again, hareyu keragle osayir. That ox takes on the tchum of the townspeople. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Shor shel roa. Adam shemagadol behemo shelo pam shemocher me'en l'shechina v'makirav. Supposed to listen to this. The shepherd case is the following. It's a guy who raises his own flock, but sometimes he sells to townspeople, but he never sells to people out of town, right? He stays there from out of towners, right? So we'll say, so ultimately he only sells to people in town. So what's the status of that animal? So Rashi says, Hariyu karagle osa ansheyer apayim amalachuruach. Essentially, that animal has the tchum of that. That since the roa knows that if he sells, he's going to sell to someone local, therefore the animal takes on the local tchum. Quite amazing. This will say, so remember again, the halacha was, Mishnah said, that if you lend your friend a utensil on Erev Yom Tiv, what's the halacha? The utensil takes on the tchum of the borrower, to which the Gemara says, Pshita. Or isn't that obvious? In other words, if the utensil was in the domain of the borrower on Erev Yom Tiv, so of course it takes on his tchum, to which the Gemara says, Lo tzricha shelo masru lo ela b'yom tiv. Oh, no, what's the case? I will say, this is a case of where the object, interestingly enough, Ruvain made the arrangement to borrow with Shimon on Erev Yom Tiv, but Ruvain didn't actually take the kli, borrow the kli, until when? Until Yom Tiv itself. You might have thought that at the end of the day, since Ruvain doesn't actually physically have possession of the utensil on Erev Yom Tiv, therefore halacha l'maisa, maybe the utensil keeps or retains the tchum of its owner. Kamash malon, no. Kamash malon, since ultimately, again, Ruvain knows that he's going to borrow it from Shimon. Shimon knows that he's going to borrow it from Ruvain. It takes on the borrower's tchum, even though it doesn't come to the possession of the borrower until Yom Tiv itself. If you borrow a utensil from your friend on Erev Yom Tiv, even though you didn't give it to him. So we'll say, essentially, the way the Gemara is setting up this case, the case of what the Gemara calls Hashoel Kli Mechavero Me'erev Yom Tiv, means what? I arrange to borrow a kli from Ruvain on Erev Yom Tiv. But when do I actually borrow it? When do I actually take it? On Yom Tiv itself. The chiddush, therefore, is, since I know that I'm going to borrow it, and Ruvain, the owner of the kli, knows that I'm going to borrow it, halacha l'maisa, it takes on the borrower's tchum. And the chiddush is, apapi shlo nasnu lo, even though the owner did not give it to the borrower on Erev Yom Tiv, Harehu kiragle hashoel. It takes on the tchum ultimately of the borrower. Incredible. Next case, Rabbi say, b'yom tiv kiragle amashil. What's the next case? If I borrow something, Rabbi say, let's say I had no conversations with Ruvain prior to Yom Tiv. I borrow something from Ruvain on Yom Tiv itself. What's the halacha? So the object takes on the tchum of the lender. Right, of the lender. So the Gemara says, so pshita, isn't that obvious? Listen to this. Deragil v'sha'al minei. I will say, what's the case? This is interesting. The case is where this guy always borrows stuff from me. Right? Ruvain always borrows stuff from me. Ma'u detema. What would you have thought? Birshusei kamokim la. So I will say, if somebody always borrows something from me, every Yom Tiv, he comes over and he borrows something from me. So I used to have enjoyed this when I used to have a neighbor a long time ago. I used to have a neighbor who every he didn't drink wine. Difficult to understand by itself, right? Didn't drink wine, but every Yom Tiv he used to come over to borrow a corkscrew. Every single Yom Tiv. His family would come in every single Yom Tiv. Every meal would be about 7 minutes into the Suda. And this was every Suda, right? Every Suda. Can I borrow a corkscrew? Can I borrow a corkscrew? So every Yom Tiv. I offer, so you could keep it. We have a few. No, I don't need it. I'm like, you don't need it. You come here every single meal, every single day of Yom Tiv. Yes, you need it. I need it. I need you to take it. So interesting enough, so the Gemara says, what's the case? The case over here is, let's say there's a guy who always borrows something from you. He always borrows something from you. So what the Gemara says, I might have thought that halacha l'maisa, since I know he's going to borrow it, essentially on Erev Yom Tiv, I already put it in his rishus, right? In other words, I know he's coming over, so I put it on the side for you. It's yours. So maybe that endows it with the borrower's tchum, even though the borrower didn't come to me on Erev Yom Tiv. Since I know he's going to come, maybe that gives it his tchum. Kamash malan meimar amar dilma mashkich inish achrina va'azal v'sha'amine. So we'll say kamash malan. We don't say that because the lender could say, the owner could say, maybe this guy will find someone else to borrow from. So I will say, so the chiddush over here is, so again, the simple case is, if you borrow something on Yom Tiv, the object retains the owner, the tchum of its owner. The chiddush is, even if it's in a habitual situation, where the same person, the same borrower, is always borrowing from the same lender, you might have thought that therefore the lender effectively kind of transfers it over to Magabe Tchum on Erev Yom Tiv. Kamash Malan, no. Kamash Malan, that the owner thinks to himself, okay, I understand he's always been borrowing for the same thing, the same number of years, whatever it is, but maybe this time I'll find something different. And therefore, if there's no arrangement made on Erev Yom Tiv, halacha l'maisa, the object has the tchum of the owner. And therefore, when the borrower ends up borrowing it on Yom Tiv, remember again, the borrower is limited with this object to the tchum of the owner. Incredible. So now we're going to get into this sugya. So remember again, the Mishnah said, if a woman is making bread, and let's say she went ahead and she borrowed mayim umelach. She borrowed water and salt. So what's the halacha? The Mishnah said, hare elu kiragle shtehen. Ultimately, this is very interesting. The dough will be limited to the shared tchum. So we'll say this dough essentially is looked at as a partnership object, right? Because again, we'll call, Rachel owns the water and the salt, and Leah owns the flour and whatever else, right? So therefore, again, it's a partnership object. Because it's a partnership object, what happens with partnership items? Ultimately, again, they're limited to the overlapping tchum areas of the two partners. So that's how the Gemara describes it. They'll both say, it's an incredible ma'isa. Kisalak Rabbi Abba. When Rabbi Abba went to Eretz Yisrael, Rashi says, Kisalak Rabbi Abba, Kisharatza lalos, when he was thinking about going to Eretz Yisrael, O Kishahaya baderach, or when he was actually traveling to Eretz Yisrael, Amar Tfilazu. He said the following tefillah. I will say, what was his tefillah? This is beautiful. We'll see. Interesting. Yehei Rava, Chodesh Baruch Hu, should be your will. De'ema milsa detiskabel. Let me say something in the Beis Medrash that the other Talmidei Chachamim will accept. Now, if you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, Ema milsa d'shmaisa. So let me say over halacha, ditiskabel lechach me hamakom shelo avosh. So we'll say Rabbi Abba was davening as he was going from Babel to Eretz Yisrael. When I come to Eretz Yisrael, let me say something in the Beis Medrash that will be accepted. I don't want to be. Rashi says I don't want to be embarrassed. I don't want to be embarrassed. Shelo avosh. I don't want to be embarrassed. So let me walk into the Beis Medrash, say something that everyone is going to accept. Okay, so what happened? Kisal, he comes to Eretz Yisrael. Ashkechel Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chanina bar Papi, Rabbi Zera. He found Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chanina bar Papi, Rabbi Zera, Va'amrei Rabbi Avar, Rabbi Shimon bar Paz, Rabbi Yitzchok Nafcha. These rabbanim were sitting, V'yasi v'ka'amri, and they were declaring the following sugya. They were talking the following concept. Amai, they were talking about this Mishnah. Why does the Mishnah say that if Rachel borrows water and salt from Leah to make her dough, that now the dough is limited to the overlapping tchumin of Rachel and Leah, which will say essentially means that what? Leah, right, because of her water and salt, is what? A partner in the dough. Why? Why don't we say that the water and salt are bottle to the dough? I was supposed to say, you're right, there's a mixture of things, but why don't we say water and salt are bottle to the dough? So the Gemara says, so what happened? Amar le Rabbi Abba. So Rabbi Abba, remember again, Rabbi Abba's one who davened, let me say something that's going to be accepted. So Rabbi Abba said as follows. All right, now before you turn the page, actually look at the last Rashi. Amar Rabbi Abba, umishum dechelka shalzu muat ba yovet shma milikros al isa. So we'll say, what Rabbi Abba is going to argue about is as follows. You guys are suggesting that because all Rachel has Leah has in the dough is the water and salt. She has such a minute portion. her minute portion should become batel in the majority. Rabbi Abba says, I'm going to show you why that thinking is flawed. I'm going to Rabbi Abba, I'm beis. Hareshin is ariv lo kav chitin ba'asara kabin chitin shel chavero. We'll say, let's say, I have 10 kabin of wheat. And what happened? 1 kav of Ruvain's wheat gets mixed in with 10 kabin of my wheat. We'll say, is anyone going to say, well, sorry, Ruvain, you lost your wheat. You have 10 kav, I have 1 kav, you have 1 kav, I have 10 kabin, batel barov, right? Your 1 kav is batel in my 10 kabin, and that's it. Would anyone say such a thing like that? Rabbi said, of course not. Of course not. Now again, what I have to return to Reuven and how I have to return it to him, do I have to give him a kav of wheat, or do I just give him the financial value, whatever it is? But one thing is clear, which is what? Reuven's portion is not what? It's not batel. That's the point that Rabbi Abba is making. In other words, just because something is in a small proportional ratio does not automatically result in its bittul. That's the point that he's making. So again, Rabbi Abba wants to say, therefore, even though all Leah has in this dough is salt and water, halacha l'maisa, it's not batel. It's what happened. Achiku alei. Both say, so all of the other Rabbanim in the Beis Medrash began to laugh at him. They laughed at Rabbi Abba. They said, that's absolutely ridiculous. So what happens? So Amr Lei, so we'll say, we'll see ultimately again, we'll see exactly why they laughed at him. Amr Lehus, Rabbi Abba was very offended. He said, Gulsaichu shakli, did I take your clothing that you're laughing at me? In other words, he was very offended that they were laughing at him. Did I take your clothing that you're laughing at me? It didn't quite work out. They laughed at him even more. So I will say, so this story is actually quite fascinating. So first of all, before we go on, let's just spend a moment. What's going on over here, right? We know the halachic exchange is fascinating, but the actual story is bizarre. I understand what Rabbi Abba is davening for. I understand that piece. But at the end of the day, why are they laughing at him? And why does the Gemara record this story? In other words, even if Rabbi Abba said something that wasn't correct, the Gemara is filled with Rabbanim who put forward ideas and not correct. What's happening over here? So I want to share with you two incredible things. The first is a Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer quotes this concept. I saw this brought down in the Sefer Daf al Daf. He quotes two different ideas. He quotes one in Shalas Teshuvas, Arach Chaim Siman Reish Chas, and one on Shas, is Chassam Sofer on Shas, the end of Parak Mashilin. I'm going to quote to you just a line from the end of Parak Mashilin. The Chassam Sofer says this is dramatic. He says, Ach Musar Heskel Nishma Mizeh. He said, why? You see, when you read the story, what it sounds like is that Rabbi Abba is getting punished. In other words, he davened, let me say something that's going to be accepted. And not only was it not accepted, but what happened? He was made fun of. We'll say, right? In other words, it happens all the time. Now that's ridiculous. That doesn't make any sense. To laugh at someone, and by the way, when he expresses his frustration about being laughed at, to laugh at him again is a pretty dramatic thing. So says the Chassam Sofer, when you look at this story, it looks like Rabbi Abba is being punished. What is he being punished for? So the Chassam Sofer says something amazing. He says, Sheyomar milsa de tiskabel. What was Rabbi Abba's mistake? Rabbi Abba's mistake was, says the Chassam Sofer, that he davened, let me say something that will be accepted by other people. Malo im yekabel imlo. Says the Chassam Sofer, why do you daven that other people should accept your opinion? Amar divarecha l'shem shamayim. When you speak words of Torah, when you speak in general in life, whatever you say should be truth. If people listen, if they don't listen, if they accept, if they don't accept, the goal in life is not acceptance. Right? The goal in life is not to get others to follow my will. The goal in life is not to be right. The goal in life is to be true. So says the Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Abba, that's what you're davening for? For people to go ahead and accept what you have to say? It's a shtickle gaiva. Who says they have to accept what you have to say? Your goal in life should be that when you learn Torah, it should be a pursuit of emes. And Abba say, and therefore again he's laughed at because the tefillah, says the Chassam Sofer, was an inappropriate. And Abba say, what a profound lesson on two levels. First of all, how we learn. Why we learn. Why do we learn? I will say, why do we engage in the pursuit of Torah? Is it to be smarter than someone else? Is it to be able to tell someone else what to do? Is it to build a covenant? No, it's because it's the pursuit of MS. Isn't that what we want in life? I just want the truth. And even when I think I have the truth, often in life I don't really have the truth. Torah gives me clarity. And when I learn Torah, my goal is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'm running, I'm searching, I'm seeking MS. That's all I'm seeking in life. I'm seeking MS. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two, I will say, is we spend so much time in life trying to be right. Trying to be right. You know, there's a beautiful Sfas Emes. The Sfas Emes says, you know the difference between children and adults? I've mentioned this before. It says, adults want to be right. Children are content with being happy. And he says that's why a child goes ahead and gets upset. Child has a little kids, fundamental meltdown. What do? You give the kid an ice cream, a candy bar, and what? Suddenly, everything is fantastic. How does that work? Because children value being happy over being right. Adults, you get into a machlokes with someone, and that machlokes could go on for 20 years. You don't even know what you're arguing about anymore. Why? Because adults often value being right over being happy. The goal in life is not to be right. That's not the goal in life. And I will say, this is without getting into any contemporary, societal commentary. This is the machala now, right? It's not Corona that's the machala. This is the machala in the machala. Everyone has to be right. Everyone has to be right. I have to be right. And if there's someone who disagrees with me, that erodes my sense, I have to be right. Who says you have to be right? You have to be emistic in life. People listen to you, people don't listen to you. You are right, you're not right. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one who decides what's right and what's wrong. HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides what's MS. My job, ultimately, is to pursue MS, not to always try to be right. Maybe to learn a little bit from children and to value happiness ultimately over being right. Okay, and I'll tell you just one last thing. Well, so listen to this. There's a beautiful Divrei Yoel, the Satmar Rav, and then we really have to go on. The Satmar Rav says something amazing. The Satmar Rav said this over in Parshas Naso before he took his first trip to Eretz Yisrael. So the Satmar Rav Zecher Tzaddik V'Kadosh L'Bracha said, listen to this. He said, the Milsa, when Rabbi Abba says Milsa, right? Yehei Rava de'ema Milsa de Tiskabel. I want to say a Milsa, a thing that's going to be accepted. What's the thing? So says the Satmar Rav, Miloshon Tfila Ubakasha. Milsa doesn't mean a Dvar Halacha like Rashi. Milsa means Tfila, prayer. So what was Rabbi Abba David? He said, get ready for this. Vihine Eretz Yisrael hu makom ma'aver kol tfilos Yisrael michol mekomos moshvaseim sha'olim l'shamayim derech Eretz Yisrael. Says the Rebbe, quoting the Zohar, all the tfilos in the world go up through Eretz Yisrael. Wherever you daven, tfilos don't go straight up. I mean, they go straight up, but they go via Eretz Yisrael. I daven here in Baltimore, my tefillos go from Baltimore to Eretz Yisrael, and Eretz Yisrael, they ascend to Shamayim. Good. He says, over Eretz Yisrael, over my tefillos derech kodesh HaKadoshim. And in Eretz Yisrael, all of the tefillos ascend by way of the area of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. V'zeu she'uspalo Rabbi Abba de'ema milsa titiskabel. Dahinu she'tfilosa be'eretz Yisrael ya'asu rosh v'izkab mamaram. Rabbi Abba was davening like this. He says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so often I daven in chutz la'aretz, and I'm not always sure if my tfilos have the requisite kavanah to make it to Eretz Yisrael. But now I'm going to Eretz Yisrael. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu give me the strength to daven a proper tefillah. Ema milsa de tiskabel. To daven a tefillah that is going to finally be accepted, because it doesn't have to travel from Babel to Eretz Yisrael. Rather, what? It just goes straight up. So it says the Satmar Rav, and also he said this right before he went to Eretz Yisrael, that every day when we daven, our tefillos go through Eretz Yisrael, which Rabbi say is such an incredible nechama, because especially for those of us who have been actually locked out of Eretz Yisrael for such a long time, it creates not even an existential pain, but an actual physical pain. But at least I know that every single time I daven, there's a piece of me through my tefillah that journeys through Eretz Yisrael, up through the Kodesh HaKadoshim, to the Ribbon Shalom. Now, the Satmar Rav doesn't explain the end of the story, right? That part is not explained. But again, a Rebbe doesn't have to explain the whole thing, right? A Rebbe just explains what he wants to explain, and the Hasidim are mekabel. And if you don't appreciate that, then you're a misnagid. Okay, so the Gemara goes weiter. So says the Gemara, Amar Rav Oshia Shapir Avar Dachicha Alei. So Rav Oshia said, no, they were right for laughing at Rabbi Abba. So listen to this. Why did Rabbi Abba bring up a case of 1 kav of my friend's wheat that falls into 10 kabin of my wheat? We'll say to go ahead and kind of transition for a moment into another area of halacha, hilchos taruvas. In the laws of mixtures, as well as in chulin, there are 2 different types of mixtures. There's min b'mino, min b'she'eno mino. Like mixtures, unlike mixtures. There's a machlokes if min b'mino is batal. There's a machlokes if that works. Min b'she'eno mino, 2 unlike dissimilar items. There's a much easier derech to say that it's batal. Why did Rabbi Abba set up the case of like items that got mixed together? Why doesn't he go ahead and bring up a case of chitin b'seorin? Tahavelu min b'she'eno mino, or min b'she'eno mino batal. Both say that would have been such a better case. Bring up a case of 1 kav of barley that falls into 10 kabin of wheat. To which the Gemara says, chitin b'chitin nihi nami d'lar Yehuda lo batal, l'rabbanan miftal batal. Okay, even though min b'mino might not be batal according to Rabbi Yehuda, but right, Rabbi Yehuda is the opinion, we're going to quote him a couple of times, is the opinion who holds min b'mino ain't batal. Like items are not batal in each other. But the Rabbanan do hold that they are. Omnura Safra, Moshe. Now Moshe means by Moshe, by the life of Moshe Rabbeinu. Shapir Ka'amrit, are you really saying good? Right? Are you really saying at the end of the day that they did the right thing by laughing at Rabbi Abba? He's not asking from like a midos perspective. He's asking from a halachic perspective. Say this is a fascinating case. Say, listen to this. This is fascinating. When you sold wheat, let's say I'm a wheat salesman, a wheat merchant. It is understood that when you purchase wheat, there's some amount of impurities mixed into that wheat. Right? That's understood. That's understood. So they will say, watch this. I'm selling a kav of wheat to Ruvain. Okay? So what happens? I have a very well-meaning friend. And what does my well-meaning friend know? Oh, he knows Silber's selling a kav of wheat to Ruvain. What does he do? He picks out all of the impurities from the wheat. So we'll say, what's the halacha in that case? Chayiv l'shalim lo demechitim. My well-meaning friend, we'll call him Shimon, is chayiv to pay me. Because why? Because as a result of his removal of the impurities, what's happened? I now have to give Ruvain more wheat. He's causing us. So we'll say, in other words, it's accepted transactionally that when you purchase wheat, when you purchase a kav of wheat, everyone knows that what? What are you not getting? A complete kav of wheat. You're getting a complete kav. But included in that kav ultimately are impurities. Now Shimon thinks he's a big tzaddik and he's removing all the impurities. That's great. You're a big tzaddik. Be a big tzaddik on your own dime. Right? He owes me now for the extra amount of wheat that I now have to go ahead and give to Ruvain. Both say, what do you see from that? Alma kila chasre. Now both say, now think about this for just a moment. Those impurities by themselves, are they worth anything? No. But clearly, they do generate they are real, and ultimately they're part of the mixture. Rabbi said, now why is he bringing this up? Because remember, what are we trying to say? We're trying to suggest that water and salt should be bottled to the dough. All the Gemara is trying to show over here, Rav Safra is trying to point out, is Rabbi Abba's not so wrong. In other words, even something very insignificant, ultimately, again, is not necessarily bottled in the mixture. So to over here by the dough, halacha lemaisa, even though Leah is only contributing water and salt, and Rachel contributes the dominant amount, halacha lemaisa, Leah's minimal contribution is not batal. Okay, but there's also a difference, again, halacha lemaisa, between what we call mamon sheish lo tovin, mamon she'ein lo tovin, which means money that has someone who's claiming it and money that has no one who's claiming it. So I will say, Rashi points out over here. So if you look at Rashi, Rashi says, "V'lo shani le umas nisin mamon she'ein lo tovin hayom." So we'll say, remember again in the Mishnah, Leah is lending the water and salt. And she's giving it. In other words, she's not retaining an ownership interest in it. So she's essentially relinquishing ownership of it. So why wouldn't her water and salt be batal? As opposed to some of these other cases where someone is still retaining an ownership interest, to which the Gemara says, Amar leila tamech, hada amrav chista, that's what Rav Chista said, neveila betela b'shchuta, lefishi efshel. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up, by the way, don't worry, the last daf, which is Sunday, Meir Hashem, is only in Amud Aleph. So we have plenty of time. Emir Hashem. We'll pick up over here with this case. So we'll say, so just to understand what we're leaving off with. We're leaving off trying to figure out why Mishnah said that Allah Maisa, Rachel borrows water and salt to make her dough. When they make the dough on Yom Tov, the dough has only the overlapping tchumen of both of them. What we're trying to figure out is why is that? After all, at the end of the day, why don't we say that the water and salt should be bottled to the dough? Emir Hashem, to be continued tomorrow. Shkoyach.